Imagine being humiliated in front of your peers by someone meant to guide you. What happens when the tables turn? Stay tuned for a story of resilience, redemption, and unexpected lessons. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of the sterile precision that defined Elmwood Academy. Nestled in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, the school was a fortress of privilege, its manicured lawns and ivy-covered brick walls whispering tales of legacy and exclusivity. For Colin Anderson, however, it felt more like a gilded cage. He sat at the back of Mrs. Carolyn Armstrong's advanced math class, his notebook open to a page half filled with equations he'd struggled to solve the night before. Colin wasn't used to struggling. Back at his old school, he'd been one of the top students, quietly excelling without drawing much attention to himself. But here at Elmwood, things were different. The stares of his classmates lingered longer than they should, their whispers sharp enough to cut through the silence between lectures. He wasn't sure if it was because he was new, because he was black, or simply because he didn't fit into the polished mold of the other students. Maybe it was all three. Colin had transferred to Elmwood just a few weeks ago, after his father's business brought them to the area. His dad, James Anderson, was a man who valued hard work and resilience above all else. "You'll do fine," James had said when Colin expressed his hesitation about switching schools. "Just show them who you are." Easier said than done, Colin thought now, glancing around the room. Mrs. Armstrong cleared her throat, pulling him out of his thoughts. She stood at the front of the classroom, a stack of graded tests in her hand. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, a look Colin had come to associate with disappointment. "All right, class," she began, her voice clipped. "Let's go over the results of your latest test. Some of you did well, but others." She let the sentence trail off, her gaze sweeping across the room like a hawk searching for prey. One by one, she called out names and scores. Each announcement was met with either smug satisfaction or quiet groans. When she reached Colin's name, there was a pause, a deliberate beat that made the air feel heavier. "Colin," she said finally, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "Well, I suppose we can't all be winners, can we?" She held up his test for the entire class to see, the red D- scrawled across the top glaring like an accusation. A ripple of laughter spread through the room, though it was quickly stifled when Mrs. Armstrong shot a warning glance at the offenders. Colin stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening as heat crept up his neck. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, their judgment pressing down like a physical force. It wasn't just the grade that stung. It was the way she'd singled him out, as if his failure was somehow more significant than anyone else's. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah, the girl he'd been too shy to talk to, glance away awkwardly. Even Marcus, who always seemed eager to make fun of him, looked uncomfortable. Colin clenched his fists under the desk, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Colin bolted from his seat before Mrs. Armstrong could say another word. The hallway was a blur of faces and voices, none of which registered as he pushed through the crowd and headed outside. The crisp autumn air hit him like a slap, grounding him momentarily. He walked aimlessly until he found himself near the edge of the soccer field, where a group of students practiced drills. No one paid him any attention. Pulling out his phone, Colin hesitated for a moment before dialing his dad's number. It rang twice before James answered, his deep voice instantly calming. "Hey son, everything okay?" Colin swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "Not really," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened at school today." James listened intently as Colin recounted the events of the morning. The unfair treatment, the laughter, the humiliation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Colin worried he'd upset his dad. But then James spoke, his tone firm yet reassuring. "Listen to me, Colin. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're better than this, and we're going to handle it together. Trust me." Colin nodded, even though his dad couldn't see him. "Okay," he said softly. "What do we do?" "We start by showing them exactly who we are," James replied. "And trust me, son, They're not ready for what's coming. When Colin hung up the phone, he was determined to fight for justice and prove to himself that he was more than the sum of someone else's assumptions. The drive home was quiet, but Colin's mind raced. His father's words echoed in his head. We start by showing them exactly who we are. It sounded simple enough, but Colin couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he didn't even know who we were anymore. The boy who had walked into Elmwood Academy weeks ago felt like a stranger now, someone overshadowed by whispers and assumptions. Who were they going to show? And what would it take to make people see him for who he truly was? When they arrived at their house, a modern, two-story home tucked away on a tree-lined street, Colin followed his dad to the garage. James rarely invited him inside. It was his sanctuary, a place where the world outside seemed to fade away. But today, the door was already open, revealing rows of gleaming cars lined up like trophies. Colin had always known his father owned a successful business, but seeing the collection in one space made the reality hit differently. James moved with purpose, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete floor as he walked past a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, and finally stopped in front of the Bugatti Chiron. Its carbon fiber body caught the light streaming through the skylight above, making it look almost unreal. Colin stared, momentarily forgetting why they were there. His mind caught between awe at the machine before him and the turmoil still swirling inside. James turned to face his son, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "Colin," he began, his voice steady, "do you know what all this represents?" Colin hesitated, unsure how to respond. The cars? Success? Wealth? He shook his head slightly. "Not really. It's not just about cars," James said, gesturing toward the gleaming collection around them. "This is about building something bigger than yourself, about proving people wrong when they doubt you. And one day all of this, it could be yours, but only if you're ready to take it." Colin blinked, surprised by the weight of his father's words. "Mine?" he echoed softly, glancing at the Bugatti again. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of everything James had worked for: perseverance, ambition, and the refusal to let anyone define him. "Not just these cars," James clarified, stepping closer. "Everything I've built, everything we stand for. One day it'll be up to you to carry that forward. But first, you need to believe in yourself. You need to stop letting other people decide your worth." Colin swallowed hard, the truth of his father's words sinking in. For so long, he'd let the whispers and judgments of others shape how he saw himself. But standing here now, surrounded by the tangible results of his father's determination, he realized something. He didn't have to accept their version of who he was. James placed a firm hand on Colin's shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "People judge based on what they think they know," he said, his tone quiet but fierce. "Today, we're going to show them exactly who we are, and maybe teach them a lesson while we're at it." Colin frowned, unsure of what his dad meant. "What kind of lesson?" "The kind that makes people stop assuming and start listening," James replied, opening the driver's side door. "Get in." This wasn't just about revenge or proving a point, but claiming his place in the world, refusing to shrink under the weight of someone else's prejudice. As James handed him the keys to the Bugatti, Colin understood the gesture wasn't about driving a luxury car. It was about taking control of his own narrative. As they pulled out of the driveway, Colin glanced at his dad. James looked different behind the wheel, more like the man from the stories he'd heard growing up, the fearless race car driver who once dominated tracks around the world. There was a confidence in his posture, a calm authority that commanded respect without needing to ask for it. They drove in silence for a while, the streets blurring past as James navigated toward Elmwood Academy. Colin watched the scenery change, the manicured lawns and luxury cars giving way to the familiar gates of the school. When they arrived, the Bugatti drew immediate attention. Students gathered near the windows, phones snapping photos as James parked with precision. For a brief moment, Colin felt exposed, sitting beside his father in a car that screamed wealth and success. What would his classmates think when they realized this was his dad? But James didn't give him time to dwell on it. As soon as they stepped out, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Colin recognized the mix of awe and confusion on people's faces. They knew James Anderson. They'd seen him on TV or read about him in magazines, but no one had connected him to Colin. Until now, James led the way, his presence commanding enough to part the sea of students as they entered the building. Colin followed closely, trying to ignore the stares and murmurs trailing behind them. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Teachers and administrators appeared almost instantly, their expressions shifting from surprise to nervous anticipation. Word traveled fast. James Anderson wasn't just visiting. In the principal's office, tension crackled like static electricity. Principal Lewis greeted James with forced enthusiasm, clearly unprepared for whatever was about to unfold. Carolyn Armstrong sat nearby, her usual composure faltering as she realized the gravity of the situation. She tried to explain herself, stammering excuses about maintaining discipline and high standards, but James cut her off with a single raised hand. "This isn't about discipline," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about respect. My son has been treated unfairly, and I won't stand for it." Carolyn's face flushed red, and she glanced at Principal Lewis for support, but he avoided her gaze. James continued, revealing his role as the anonymous benefactor funding the school's robotics lab, a revelation that left everyone speechless. He demanded accountability. Throughout the meeting, Colin stayed silent, observing the way his father carried himself. There was no anger in James' demeanor, only resolve. He spoke with authority, yes, but also with a sense of justice that resonated deeply with Colin. He understood the power of standing up. By the time they left the office, Carolyn was visibly shaken. She begged for leniency, promising to change her ways, but James remained unmoved. "If you want to keep your job," he told her coldly, "then you'll apologize, not just to my son, but to everyone here." As they walked back to the car, Colin knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: the world wouldn't see him the same way again. The morning sun filtered through the auditorium's tall windows, casting shadows across the rows of students seated in stiff-backed chairs. Anticipation hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that made even the smallest movements, shuffling feet, whispered conversations, the rustle of papers, seem louder than usual. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. Rumors had spread like wildfire overnight, fueled by social media posts and hushed hallway exchanges. "James Anderson is coming," they said. "He's here for Colin." Colin sat near the back, his fingers drumming nervously against his knees. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind replaying every possible scenario of what might unfold today. Would Carolyn apologize? Would she try to defend herself? And if she did, would it matter? The weight of expectation pressed down on him, heavier than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about proving something to himself, to his classmates, and maybe even to his dad. When James entered the room, the murmurs stopped instantly. He walked with purpose, his presence commanding attention without needing to say a word. Dressed in a tailored suit with his old racing cap perched jauntily atop his head, he exuded confidence, a stark contrast to the nervous fidgeting of Principal Lewis and Mrs. Armstrong, who stood at the podium waiting for him. Every eye followed James as he took his place at the front of the stage, Colin trailing behind him like a shadow. Principal Lewis stepped forward first, clearing his throat awkwardly as he addressed the assembled students. "Good morning, everyone. We're honored to have Mr. James Anderson join us today. As many of you know, Mr. Anderson has been a generous supporter of our school, particularly through his sponsorship of the robotics lab. Today, he has some important words to share." The principal's voice trailed off, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. James didn't waste time filling it. Stepping up to the microphone, he looked out at the sea of faces, his expression unreadable but undeniably intense. "Thank you, Principal Lewis," he began, his deep voice resonating through the auditorium. "I'm here today because my son, Colin, experienced something no student should ever have to endure: humiliation and disrespect at the hands of someone meant to guide and support him. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd, but James continued without pause. Mrs. Armstrong singled Colin out publicly because of assumptions she made about him. Assumptions based on prejudice, ignorance, and bias. His words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending shockwaves through the room. Even those who hadn't known Colin personally shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the gravity of the moment. Carolyn rose shakily from her seat, her face pale but determined. She approached the podium, her hands trembling as she gripped the sides. "I want to apologize," she stammered, her voice barely audible at first. Clearing her throat, she tried again. "To Colin and to all of you, what I did was wrong. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I failed not only as a teacher but as a person. I promise to do better moving forward." Her apology hung in the air, fragile and incomplete. Some students clapped politely, but most remained silent, unsure how to react. Carolyn glanced at James, then at Principal Lewis, desperation flickering in her eyes. But James didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he turned to Colin, nodding slightly as if passing the torch. Colin hesitated, his heart pounding as he stood up. Walking to the front of the stage felt like crossing an endless distance, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the microphone, he gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The sheer number of eyes watching him threatened to overwhelm him. Then he took a deep breath and began. "I don't want pity," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "What I want is for people to stop judging others based on appearances or assumptions. Just because someone doesn't look like you, or come from where you come from, doesn't mean they're any less capable or any less worthy of respect." The room fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, electric with unspoken thoughts. Colin's words seemed to hang suspended in the air, reverberating long after he finished speaking. He could see the impact they had on his classmates. The way Sarah's lips parted slightly in surprise, the way Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the way others exchanged glances filled with newfound understanding. When Colin stepped away from the podium, the applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew louder, more confident. It wasn't just for him. It was for the message he'd delivered, one that resonated far beyond the walls of Elmwood Academy. James watched quietly from the side of the stage, pride evident in his eyes. Colin felt a sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because he'd taken a stand. After the assembly, things began to change slowly but surely. Carolyn kept her promise, working harder to connect with Colin and offering extra tutoring sessions to help him improve his grades. Though their relationship remained strained, there was a newfound mutual respect between them. Other teachers started paying closer attention to how they interacted with their students, ensuring fairness and inclusivity were prioritized. Meanwhile, Colin found solace in the robotics lab, pouring his energy into projects that challenged him creatively and intellectually. Under James' guidance, he began experimenting with modifications for high-performance vehicles, blending his passion for engineering with his father's expertise in mechanics. Together, they worked on designs that pushed boundaries, creating innovations that impressed even industry veterans. Though challenges remained, Colin learned that standing up for himself didn't mean shutting others out. It meant opening doors. Doors to understanding, forgiveness, and growth. And while the scars of prejudice wouldn't fade overnight, he knew he'd planted seeds of change within the hallowed halls of Elmwood Academy. Weeks passed, and the initial shock of James Anderson's arrival at Elmwood Academy began to settle into something quieter but no less significant. A shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable. Colin noticed it first in small ways. The way students who had once ignored him now nodded hello in the hallways, the way teachers seemed more mindful of their words during class discussions. Even Carolyn Armstrong, though still awkward around him, made an effort to engage with him during tutoring sessions. She brought extra materials for him to review, patiently explaining concepts he struggled with and occasionally offering genuine praise when he improved. But it wasn't just about Colin anymore. The ripple effect of that day in the auditorium spread wider than anyone expected. Conversations began cropping up in classrooms and cafeterias about fairness, privilege, and the assumptions people carried without realizing it. Some students argued passionately. Others listened quietly, absorbing new perspectives. Sarah, the girl Colin had admired from afar, approached him one afternoon after robotics club. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything before," she admitted, her voice soft but sincere. "What happened to you? It made me think about how we treat each other here, about what kind of place we want this school to be." Colin was surprised by her candor but grateful for it. "It's okay," he replied, managing a small smile. "I think everyone's learning something." In truth, Colin himself was learning more than he ever anticipated. Working alongside his father in the garage became a kind of therapy, a way to channel his frustrations into something productive. James taught him not only about engines and aerodynamics but also about resilience and patience. Together, they developed modifications for high-performance vehicles, experimenting with designs that pushed the limits of speed and efficiency. One project in particular, a custom suspension system inspired by innovations in robotics, caught the attention of industry professionals. When James presented it at a trade show, he credited Colin as a co-designer, earning him recognition far beyond what he'd imagined possible. Back at school, Colin found himself stepping into a leadership role within the robotics lab. His newfound confidence spilled over into other areas of his life, allowing him to speak up when he saw injustice or inequality. During a group project in history class, for instance, he challenged a fellow student who dismissed the contributions of marginalized communities throughout history. "You can't just erase people because they don't fit your narrative," Colin said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. To his surprise, his classmates listened, and later several of them thanked him for speaking out. Still, there were moments when doubt crept back in. Late at night, lying awake in bed, Colin sometimes wondered if anything had truly changed, or if people were simply being polite while waiting for things to return to normal. But then he'd remember the conversations he'd had, the connections he'd forged, and the progress he'd seen firsthand. Change wasn't instantaneous, he realized. It was messy and imperfect, full of starts and stops. But it was real. One evening, as he and James worked late in the garage, Colin paused to watch his dad tinker with an engine. The hum of machinery filled the space, punctuated by the occasional clink of tools against metal. "Dad," Colin said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "do you think people will forget about all this? About what happened?" James set down his wrench and turned to face his son, his expression thoughtful. "Some might," he admitted. "But that's not the point, is it? What matters is that you stood up for yourself, for others. That courage doesn't disappear, even if people stop talking about it." As the weeks turned into months, Colin continued to grow. He formed deeper friendships, joining study groups and collaborating on projects with classmates who once barely acknowledged his existence. He even mustered the courage to ask Sarah to partner with him on a science fair entry, which earned them second place and a shared sense of accomplishment. Carolyn, too, underwent a transformation of sorts. Though she remained reserved around Colin, her interactions with him grew warmer, less guarded. She encouraged him to apply for advanced placement courses the following year and wrote a glowing recommendation letter when he expressed interest in a prestigious summer engineering program. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start, a bridge built across the chasm of misunderstanding. By the end of the semester, Colin felt like a different person. Not perfect, not invincible, but stronger. Stronger in his convictions, in his ability to stand up for what was right, and in his belief that change, however slow, was always worth fighting for. As he walked across the stage at the end-of-year assembly to receive an award for excellence in robotics, he glanced out at the audience. There was James, smiling proudly, his old racing cap tilted slightly to one side. And scattered throughout the crowd were faces Colin recognized, faces that reminded him of how far he'd come. And as he stood there, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun, Colin knew one thing for certain: the journey wasn't over. But every step forward mattered, every voice raised against injustice mattered, and every act of courage, no matter how small, left its mark. This story reminds us that true power lies in forgiveness and breaking stereotypes. What would you have done if you were Colin? Share your thoughts below. If you like this story, Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more inspiring tales. See you in the next video.